I think from a contextual point of view, though, the starting point is that, as you can see on this image, is that we've seen a significant expansion in participation in education across the region, the Sub-Saharan African region. And this has a number of implications. One is that you've got rapidly increasing pressure on your secondary education systems in particular because of the rapid increase in demand. And those secondary systems, education systems, are struggling to cope and accommodate this increased demand. And it's reflected to some extent in the completion rates. So while you have significant participation, you don't necessarily have very good completion rates. But be that as it may, the implication is that you are seeing an increased level of educational proficiency amongst young people. And that has implications further for the labour market, because these secondary education systems are supposed to prepare young people to enter into the labour market, and the labour market is then expected to have the necessary conditions to absorb these young people. And the labour market does not keep up and does not evolve fast enough to create enough opportunities for young people coming out of these secondary education systems. And that exacerbates some of the distortions in the labour market, some of the labour market failures. And because of this continued dominance of certain sectors, such as agriculture and some of your service sectors, it's not really conducive environment for these more skilled, more educated young people to, become economically active and productive. So being less educated in some ways actually gives you more opportunity to find employment. When we look at TVET or VET specifically, we see that there's a wide variation in the levels of enrolment or participation in TVET, particularly at the secondary level. And in this regard, we refer to TVET as programs, particularly at the senior secondary level, but also to some extent in the tertiary education level below your kind of bachelor levels. In the majority of cases, tracking into TVET or into VET starts at your lower secondary levels, but through the introduction of technical subjects and that sort of like, but your share of students in vocational programs at that lower secondary level is pretty small, only 3.3% on average. And there are some who'd say that probably the early tracking into TVET at the expense of the sound foundational skills is actually a disadvantage for young people, particularly in terms of further learning and employment opportunities. But on average, at the senior secondary or at the secondary level, the upper secondary level, we see about 12% of students enrolling in vocational programs. But as I indicated earlier, there is wide variation across the region. But there is an expectation that the number of youth in TVET at the secondary level could quadruple over the next couple of decades, particularly in some countries. So that's going to have implication in terms of the capacity of the TVET sector to similarly be able to accommodate and respond to that demand. In addition, tertiary TVET in this region clearly lags behind other regions. The average gross enrollment in tertiary TVET is only about 4%. And obviously there's gender differences as well, where you'll find that women or females are enrolling in TVET fields that do not lead to high levels of skill and employment opportunities. From a perspective of what does this all mean in terms of skills, there seems to be a general sense, again, with wide variation, that skills are a major obstacle to economic growth. And you'll find that though there is an indication that skills can contribute to productivity, there is a short supply of skills, and you'll find that firms in the region are increasingly citing difficulty in finding workers with adequate skills as your economies start to grow, so they're having to import skills, and that's in fact even the case in South Africa. The dependency on imported skills is indicative of the low availability of specific types of skills that particularly your growing firms need to be able to function effectively in the economy. About 1/3 of your firms will report skills as a major constraint, and particularly your larger firms, which is high as of 50 to 70% in many countries. Your larger firms will report skills as a major obstacle to growth, and even in your smaller and micro enterprises, up to 30% of your firms will say that skills are a major obstacle. But governments are caught between there's two competing or opposing forces in some way. On the one hand, you want to support growth. You want to support these kind of growth sectors. You want to create opportunities for those and create the conducive environment for those growth sectors to realize their potential. But you also want to make sure that people can sustain their livelihoods, that you can create more sustainable livelihoods. So the governments are constantly caught between these two pressures. How much do you put into TVET around formal sector growth and catalytic growth, and how much do you continue to focus on the subsistence economy and enabling people to sustain their livelihoods? Characteristics of TVET in the region is that access to formal TVET remains a very small part of enrollment and expenditure. Formal TVET systems, as we know, are fairly expensive, and that impacts on the level of scale and the level of access of young people into those systems. There's this perception generally in the literature that formal TVET systems in the region are generally weak, fragmented, disconnected from the labor market, which results in skills misalignment, and particularly because of the continued high dependencies of many African economies on subsistence agriculture and informal employment. Your TVET systems don't generally respond to those kind of economic conditions. There's very little focus on practical training in many formal TVET systems, which is viewed as a major weakness. On average, only about 1/5 of students enter an apprenticeship or an internship, and many of these are not linked to the formal TVET system. So your TVET students who are already relatively restricted in terms of access to work-based training or apprenticeships, varying from anything from 50% in certain countries, 15% in certain countries, to as little as 4% in others. And this remains a challenge again, even in South Africa, where a large number of our TVET students do not get access to work-based learning and apprenticeships, and I'll talk to that in my presentation later. And TVET institutions find it, because there's this significant disconnect between the formal TVET system and work-based learning. TVET institutions generally find it difficult to place students in internships or apprenticeships. And therefore, your internships actually aren't made a requirement for many TVET programs. Young people who tend to also enroll in fields of study that are not necessary, where there's weak labor demand. And again, it's sort of enrolling in the sorts of programs that are not linked to occupations in demand in the labor market. And the institutions themselves are not linked to sectors where there's high labor demand and do not offer the kind of flexible pathways that are needed to access those sectors of the economy, of the labor market. There's an emphasis on wage employment, particularly in your small formal sector, and that's a critical shortcoming. because we, as indicated before, the strong dependency still or focus still on your subsistence and your informal economy. There are skills levies now, which are becoming a flavor of the day in terms of funding, TVET, formal TVET, but these are limited because your formal sectors are so small. And even these skills levies don't necessarily contribute to great inclusion because there are distortions in how they operate. But TVET does seem to be more effective than general education in helping young people get their first job and transition into the world of work. But lifetime earnings are higher amongst those that attend general education. And this is likely to increase if you don't modernize your TVET systems. And as I indicated earlier, having lower levels of education is actually more likely to lead to employment. And we found here that many of our formal business, in effect, small businesses in particular, are not likely to recruit young people out of TVET colleges. They would sooner actually take them off the street than take them out of a TVET college, and there's a number of reasons for that. But if you are struggling, obviously, in the education system, you're unlikely to get into university education. You would think that a technical tracker is a better option, but that invariably that tends to be young people who come from families with lower levels of education and where they have weaker foundational skills. So it just kind of exacerbates and creates a continuous barrier to breaking through that cycle of coming from impoverished and lower educated families and communities. There's also still a debate as to whether qualifications framework enhance or hinder the responsiveness and portability of TVET. So there is a shift. There's quite a lot of shifts in many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly in Southern Africa, to introduce qualifications frameworks with the belief that this will enhance the quality, the standards, the recognition, the portability of TVET, and we don't necessarily have firm evidence of this as yet. So, informal apprenticeships, as we know, are a primary source of TVET in the region. Recruitment in these informal apprenticeships is often through networks and ties. Although there are some indications that educational background is becoming an important criterion. And while that's important, those networks are important, it also can create levels of exclusion. Your contracts are not necessarily structured, and they vary in terms of their content. It's common sometimes for apprenticeships to even pay a fee, apprentices to pay a fee to master craftsmen, and then maybe receive a training allowance later on. They're required to sometimes bring their own tools. The quality of training is very dependent on the skills of the master craftsman and the production processes in that enterprise. So that creates a very disparate level of quality across the different training sites, workplace training sites. The master craftsman will often determine the point of completion, which means that it can vary in terms of length and etc. And you don't always get formal certification at the end of it. When we compare formal and informal apprenticeships, we can see the clear distinction between the structure of it in terms of length, in terms of the things like assessment, in terms of certification, the types of students that are attracted. In many cases, it's usually informal. As I said, it's young people with low educational achievement, whereas formal apprenticeships have higher barriers to entry. The contracts are more structured and regulated in your formal system, as I've indicated, around assessments and qualification, and that larger companies are more likely to be offering formal apprenticeships rather than SMEs. At the same time, informal apprenticeships are generally more cost effective, and there are significant costs with formal apprenticeships, although there are indications of strong productivity gains which offset some of those costs. There are a variety of instances in the region taking steps to upgrade informal apprenticeships, and those are some of the areas that are of focus. It's around providing formal recognition to trades, It's about integrating your informal apprenticeships into national TVET systems. It's about introducing dual apprenticeships, and as we saw earlier, that's gaining increased interest from many countries, particularly again in your southern and Eastern Africa. There are strong interest in dual apprenticeships. There's the introduction of voucher programs as a way of supporting the upgrading of craft persons who lack formal qualifications or lack formal skills, as well as apprentices in informal apprenticeships who lack certain specialized skills that can be addressed. And then your skills levy systems, as I spoke about already, which are fairly small. So why upgrade your apprenticeships? And the ILO talks and other literature talks to a range of reasons why apprenticeships should be upgraded, addressing decent work deficits and exploitation that can happen in the workplace in an informal situation, providing access to classroom instruction, which doesn't exist and which is an important element in terms of enabling people to adapt to the labor market and engage further in further learning, having systematic assessment and recognized certification, which is important in terms of leveling, the access and the recognition of young people who are going through these apprenticeships, bringing formal TVET closer to workplace training, particularly in terms of SMEs, through kind of dual training approaches, strengthening SMEs in terms of their ability to, in terms of their own skills and their businesses. So strengthening the SMEs themselves and their ability to operate and to train, and as well as the quality of workplace learning. There are productivity gains potentially for SMEs if you are upgrading your apprenticeships. It can promote greater equity in terms of access, and it provides an enhanced structure or a basis for more effective planning. But in all of this, it can't be, it's not one or the other in terms of how we address these. It's a combination of efforts from both the business sector and the public sector in addressing some of the key areas that have to be addressed to upgrade apprenticeships effectively. And I've just tried to capture some of the areas where you need combined effort from both the business and the public sector if you're going to achieve improvements in your apprenticeships. So in summary, I think the key messages that particularly come out of the ILO is that it's not about fundamentally changing systems. It's not about fundamentally reinventing the wheel. Informal apprenticeship systems have a lot of positives around them, particularly in terms of the rules and some of the rules and some of the relationships and other sorts of things and the costs and other sort of positives that come out of that. But you need to strengthen those and address some of the weaknesses. The contract is a particular area that needs to be strengthened. The quality and the reputation of apprenticeships, and that's always an important element if you want to encourage more young people to engage in TVET, making access more transparent and equitable. So it's not about the craftsperson choosing who they would like necessarily, but based on various sorts of ties and networks, but actually opening access and making sure that there's more opportunities for young people to participate. And then how do you start to integrate your informal apprenticeships into national training systems so that they become more mainstreamed? Thank you.